They called me the embarrassment of the family, but rose to applaud when my name echoed across the ballroom. Just quiet power in every step. I let truth humiliate them. I'm Mia Reynolds, 34, stepping into the crystal-draped ballroom of the Westchester Country Club wearing my only formal dress. Navy, practical, purchased 3 days earlier when I flew home from coordinating refugee camps in Lebanon. My sister Grace was marrying into the Morrison dynasty, old Connecticut money that owned half the state's newspapers, and I was the embarrassing humanitarian sister who'd chosen helping strangers over building a respectable life. The whispers started immediately. I could feel eyes tracking my movement as I searched for familiar faces in a sea of designer gowns and tuxedos that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. Grace had warned me about tonight during our brief conversation yesterday. Her new in-laws had concerns about my unconventional lifestyle and unmarried status. Just try to blend in, she'd said, avoiding my eyes while her wedding planner arranged flowers behind her. David's family is very traditional. They don't understand your work. Standing now in the entrance to this monument of excess, ice sculptures, imported orchids, a champagne fountain, I felt the familiar discomfort of returning to a world I'd deliberately left behind. For the past 8 years, I'd lived in places where running water was luxury and safety was never guaranteed. This ostentatious display of wealth felt obscene after spending last week treating malnourished children in bombed-out hospitals. But I was here for Grace, my little sister who'd once wanted to change the world too, before she discovered how much easier it was to marry into one that already existed. My mother, Patricia, appeared beside me in a flutter of champagne silk and barely contained anxiety. "Mia, darling, you made it." Her embrace was brief, professional, like she was greeting a difficult client. You look like yourself." The backhanded compliment stung exactly as intended. My mother had been trying to fix my appearance since I was 16 and chose hiking boots over high heels for junior prom. "Where should I sit?" I asked, checking the escort cards for my assigned table. "Oh," Mom's expression shifted to uncomfortable embarrassment. "About that, David's mother thought it might be better if you sat with the extended family. Uncle Harold and Aunt Margaret will be there." I found my name card at table 12, tucked in the far corner with David's elderly relatives and what appeared to be former household staff. The message was clear. I was family, but barely. A distinguished man in his 60s watched me from across the room with unusual intensity. Unlike the other guests who looked at me with curiosity or barely concealed judgment, his gaze held something different. Recognition, maybe, or calculation. I didn't know then that within hours, this same man would stand before 300 people and change everything with words that would rewrite my place in this family forever. The ceremony took place in the club's rose garden, where Grace floated down the aisle in a dress that cost more than an entire year of medical supplies for my current project. She looked beautiful and fragile, like a porcelain doll designed for display rather than actual living. As she passed my row, our eyes met briefly. For a moment, I saw the sister who'd once talked about joining the Peace Corps, who'd cried when she learned about child soldiers in Africa, who'd promised we'd always be a team against the world. Then the moment passed, and she was once again the Morrison bride, playing her assigned role perfectly. The officiant spoke about the joining of 2 distinguished families, about continuing legacies and maintaining traditions. I thought about the Syrian refugee girls I'd been working with, all Grace's age, who'd lost everything except their determination to survive. The contrast between that real courage and this choreographed performance felt stark. During the photo session that followed, I was systematically excluded from most family shots. The photographer positioned me at the edges of group photos where I could easily be cropped out later, if included at all. "Let's get one with just the immediate families," he suggested, and I found myself stepping back while Grace's new mother-in-law, Catherine Morrison, arranged herself prominently in the center. Catherine Morrison was a woman who'd weaponized politeness into an art form. Her smile never wavered, but her eyes were constantly calculating social hierarchies and finding everyone's place in her carefully maintained world order. "Mia, dear," she said as I moved away from the photo setup, "Grace tells me you work with refugees. How? Meaningful." The pause before meaningful contained volumes of judgment. In Catherine's world, meaningful work meant charity galas and foundation boards, not actually touching the people you were supposed to help. I coordinate emergency medical services in conflict zones, I clarified. Currently focused on Syrian displacement camps. Of course, so important to help less fortunate people. Her tone suggested she was humoring a child who'd announced plans to become a princess. And you're doing this instead of building a family of your own. The question hit its target perfectly. At 34, unmarried, childless, living out of duffel bags, in places most Americans couldn't locate on a map, I was everything Catherine's generation had been taught to fear becoming. I find the work fulfilling, I said simply. I'm sure you do, dear, but surely at some point you'll want to settle down. Grace mentioned there was never a serious boyfriend. Before I could respond, she'd moved on to pose for more photos, leaving me standing alone beside the rose bushes, questioning why I'd thought coming home would be different this time. The cocktail hour brought escalating humiliations. Grace's new sister-in-law, Jennifer Morrison, cornered me by the bar with what she clearly considered friendly advice. You know, my cousin Sarah did the whole humanitarian thing too, she said, sipping her champagne. Spent 2 years in Guatemala or somewhere building schools. But then she met her husband and realized you can do just as much good through proper charitable work at home. Have you considered coming back to civilization? I am civilization, I replied. I help create it in places where it's been destroyed. Jennifer laughed, the kind of laugh that suggested I'd made a joke rather than a serious point. That's so sweet. But really, don't you miss having a real life? Real relationships? Sarah says she feels so much more fulfilled now that she's channeling her caring nature into raising children and supporting her husband's career. I excused myself before saying something that would create the scene Grace had begged me to avoid. But as I moved through the reception, it became clear that escape was impossible. David's relatives seemed to view me as an exotic specimen requiring examination and correction. His uncle Bradford held court near the champagne fountain, explaining to anyone who'd listen why international aid was fundamentally misguided. The problem with these humanitarian types, he pronounced, clearly intending for me to overhear, is they mistake good intentions for good results. Building dependency isn't compassion, it's enabling. What these countries need is strong leadership and free market principles, not handouts from bleeding hearts. The reduction of my life's work to handouts from bleeding hearts, while standing in a room where people spent more on flower arrangements than most families earned in a year, required every ounce of my professional diplomacy training. I found refuge on the terrace, where I could breathe fresh air and check messages from my team. A crisis was developing at the camp, medical supplies delayed, tensions rising between different refugee groups, children showing signs of malnutrition that required immediate intervention. My phone buzzed with urgent updates that reminded me why I'd chosen this life. Real problems requiring real solutions, not the elaborate social theater I was currently enduring for Grace's sake. "Duty calls?" a voice behind me asked. I turned to find the distinguished man who'd been watching me earlier. Up close, he had the kind of weathered authority that comes from actual responsibility rather than inherited privilege. "Emergency coordination," I confirmed, quickly finishing my message to the camp coordinator. "Always something requiring attention." "I'm James Whitfield," he said, extending his hand. "David's great-uncle on his mother's side. Mia Reynolds." "Grace's sister. I know who you are." His response carried weight that made me look at him more carefully. "I've been hoping to meet you." Before I could ask what he meant, Grace appeared on the terrace looking frazzled and beautiful in the way only brides can manage. "Mia, there you are. Mom's looking for you. Something about family photos we missed." As I followed Grace back inside, I caught James Whitfield watching me with that same calculated interest. Something about his attention felt different from the social curiosity I'd been receiving all day, but I was too tired to decode it. The evening was about to take a turn I couldn't have anticipated. During dinner, Jennifer Morrison stood up with her champagne glass and what she clearly considered a brilliant idea. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice carrying through the sophisticated sound system, "I have a wonderful suggestion." My stomach dropped as hundreds of faces turned toward the head table. "Our beautiful bride Grace has found her perfect match, but we haven't forgotten about her sister Mia." The spotlight swung toward my corner table, illuminating me like a specimen under a microscope. "Mia has traveled all the way from..." Where was it again? Syria? Iraq? Anyway, she's here all alone, and that simply won't do. The room erupted in the kind of polite murmurs that accompanied watching someone else's humiliation. Grace looked horrified but made no move to intervene. Charles Davidson is also here without a date tonight, Jennifer continued with gathering momentum, and he's one of Greenwich's most eligible bachelors. Charles, where are you? A visibly uncomfortable man in his 40s raised his hand reluctantly from a nearby table. Perfect, Jennifer beamed. Let's have Mia and Charles come to the dance floor for a proper introduction. Everyone deserves to find their special someone. The DJ, catching Jennifer's cue, made the humiliation official. Ladies and gentlemen, let's help Grace's sister find love tonight. Mia and Charles to the dance floor, please. 300 pairs of eyes fixed on me expectantly. The silence stretched until it became painful, and I could feel the collective breath of the room waiting for my response. This was the moment. I could flee, confirming every assumption about my instability and social inadequacy. I could comply, accepting public humiliation for the sake of family peace, or I could do something else entirely. I stood up, but instead of walking toward the dance floor, I headed for the exit. As I moved between tables, whispers followed my path, but I no longer cared about anyone's opinion of my choices. Outside on the terrace, I pulled out my phone and began making calls to handle the crisis at the refugee camp. Real people needed real help, and I was done pretending this elaborate charade mattered more than lives hanging in the balance. I was arranging emergency medical transport when James Whitfield appeared beside me again. That was handled with dignity, he said quietly. Was it? I feel like I just confirmed everything they think about me. You confirmed that you have better things to do than perform for people who wouldn't last a day in your world. Something in his tone made me look at him more carefully. What exactly do you do, Mr. Whitfield? He smiled slightly. James, please, and I think it's time I properly introduced myself. James Whitfield's introduction would have to wait. As I finished coordinating the medical emergency from the terrace, Grace burst through the doors with tears streaming down her face. Mia, what the hell? She demanded, her careful bridal composure finally cracking. You just humiliated me in front of everyone. Jennifer was trying to be nice. Jennifer was trying to publicly demonstrate my inadequacy for her own entertainment. You're being paranoid. She was trying to help you meet someone. I don't need help meeting someone, Grace. I need my family to respect my choices. Your choices? Grace's voice rose dangerously high. You mean your choice to live in war zones instead of building a real life? Your choice to show up here looking like you don't even care about my wedding? The accusation hit deep because part of it was true. I didn't care about the wedding the way Grace needed me to. I cared about her, but this entire production felt like expensive costume theater while people suffered in places I could actually help. I care about you, I said carefully, but I can't pretend to care about impressing people who think my life's work is a character flaw. Maybe it is, Grace exploded. Maybe choosing to live like a nomad instead of growing up is exactly what they think it is, selfish and immature and running away from real responsibility. The words hung between us like a slap. My little sister, who'd once admired my courage, now saw my choices as character flaws requiring correction. Before I could respond, Catherine Morrison appeared on the terrace with David in tow. Her expression suggested she'd come to handle an unruly child. Girls, what's all this commotion? People can hear you inside. Mia's upset about the introduction thing, Grace said quickly, throwing me under the family peace bus with practiced ease. Well, of course she is, Catherine said, her tone dripping with fake maternal concern. It must be overwhelming to be back in polite society after living in such difficult conditions. The condescension was breathtaking. She was speaking to me like I'd been living in a mental institution rather than coordinating life-saving operations in some of the world's most challenging environments. Actually, I said, my professional diplomacy finally reaching its limit, it's overwhelming to be around people who think wealth equals worth and charity work means writing checks to feel better about themselves. Catherine's perfectly composed mask slipped slightly. Excuse me? You heard me. I've spent the evening being patronized by people who have never risked anything meaningful, who have never saved a life or made a decision where failure meant people die. Your son's family treats humanitarian work like it's a phase I'll grow out of, when in reality, what I do matters more than anything happening in this room. David stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. You're out of line, Mia. My family has been nothing but welcoming. Your family has been nothing but condescending. Your sister just tried to publicly humiliate me for being unmarried. Your mother treats me like I'm mentally unstable. And your uncle explained to a room full of people why my life's work is fundamentally misguided. If that's your idea of welcoming, I'd hate to see hostility. Grace looked mortified. Mia, please, you're ruining everything. I'm telling the truth. If that ruins anything, the problem isn't with me. The confrontation was escalating exactly as I'd feared, but I was past caring about social niceties. 8 years of being dismissed by my own family while doing work that actually mattered had built up a pressure that was finally finding release. Catherine drew herself up to her full height, every inch the offended aristocrat. Young lady, I don't know what kind of values you learned living in those places, but in civilized society, we show respect for our elders and gratitude for inclusion. In civilized society, I shot back, we also show respect for people who dedicate their lives to helping others instead of treating them like social embarrassments. That's enough. David's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. You need to apologize to my mother immediately. I need to do exactly nothing, I replied. This conversation is over. As I turned to leave, Catherine's voice followed me with venom. No wonder you can't maintain relationships. Who would want to build a life with someone so selfish and disrespectful? I stopped walking, turned around, looked at this woman who'd spent the evening demonstrating exactly the kind of selfishness and disrespect she was accusing me of. You want to talk about maintaining relationships? Your son's family has spent this entire evening making it clear that my presence here is an embarrassment. You've dismissed my work, questioned my choices, excluded me from photos, seated me with strangers, and allowed your daughter to publicly humiliate me for entertainment. And you think I'm the one with relationship problems? The silence on the terrace was deafening. Through the windows, I could see wedding guests turn toward the doors, obviously listening to our raised voices. Grace was crying, David was furious, Catherine was purple with indignation, and I was finally, completely done trying to fit into their world. Grace, I love you, but I can't stay here and pretend this is okay anymore. I hope you have a beautiful marriage, but I won't be part of a family that treats me like this. I walked away from my sister's wedding, my phone already buzzing with updates from the refugee camp where my real work waited. What I didn't know was that James Whitfield had been watching the entire confrontation from just inside the doors, and he'd been taking careful notes of exactly how the Morrison family treated people they considered beneath them. 20 minutes later, as I waited for my Uber in the country club's circular drive, James appeared beside me with my purse, which I'd forgotten in my hasty exit. Thought you might need this, he said, handing it over. Thank you. I suppose you witnessed that whole disaster. I did, and I think it's time you knew exactly who you've been dealing with tonight. He pulled out his phone and showed me a news article from 6 months earlier. UN Special Envoy James Whitfield addresses Security Council on Syrian refugee crisis. I stared at the photo, then at him. You're UN Special Envoy for Refugee Affairs. I am. And Captain Mia Reynolds, your evacuation protocol from the Latakia province bombing is currently being studied as a model for emergency civilian protection in active combat zones. The world shifted slightly on its axis. How do you know about that? It's my job to know about successful humanitarian operations. Your work has saved thousands of lives, and your protocols are being implemented across 3 different conflict zones. My Uber pulled up, but I made no move toward it. Why didn't you say something earlier? Because I wanted to see how they treated you when they thought you were nobody special, and they showed me exactly what kind of people they are. James Whitfield's expression was grim with purpose. Now I think it's time those people learned exactly who they've been disrespecting all evening. I learned the details later from multiple sources, but the story became family legend within hours. He walked directly to the band leader, requested the microphone, and took center stage while I was driving back to my parents' house in my Uber, completely unaware that everything was about to change. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to addressing world leaders. May I have your attention for a moment? The chatter died immediately. James Whitfield commanded rooms without effort. For those who don't know me, I'm James Whitfield, David's great-uncle and United Nations Special Envoy for Refugee Affairs. Tonight, I've had the extraordinary honor of meeting someone whose courage has saved thousands of lives in some of the world's most dangerous places. According to Grace, who called me sobbing at midnight, you could have heard a pin drop in the ballroom. Many of you met Mia Reynolds tonight as simply Grace's sister. What you may not know is that Captain Reynolds has led some of the most successful civilian evacuation operations in recent UN history. Last year alone, her protocols saved over 3,000 Syrian refugees during active bombing campaigns. The silence was reportedly absolute. Her evacuation procedures are currently being taught to humanitarian teams across the Middle East and North Africa. Military commanders in 3 different conflict zones have specifically requested her coordination for civilian protection operations. James then did something that became the talk of Connecticut society circles for months afterward. He turned toward where I'd been sitting, though I was no longer there, and executed a formal diplomatic bow. Captain Reynolds may have left us tonight, but her absence doesn't diminish the extraordinary honor of her service. On behalf of the United Nations and the thousands of people whose lives she's saved, I thank her for her dedication to humanity's most vulnerable populations. The applause started slowly, with Grace's grandmother. Then it built as the reality of James's words sank in. The woman they'd been dismissing all evening as a failed spinster with questionable priorities was actually a decorated humanitarian whose work shaped international policy. Catherine Morrison, who'd spent the evening treating me like a social embarrassment, was now faced with the reality that she'd insulted someone whose professional reputation far exceeded anything her family had achieved. Jennifer Morrison, who'd orchestrated my public humiliation, discovered she'd mocked someone whose courage and leadership were respected by world governments. David's uncle Bradford, who'd lectured the room about the futility of humanitarian aid, learned that his expert commentary on international development had been delivered in front of someone whose actual expertise shaped UN policy. The fallout was immediate and comprehensive. Grace called me at midnight, crying so hard she could barely speak. "Mia, I'm so sorry. I had no idea about your work. Why didn't you ever tell me? Would it have mattered?" I asked. "Before tonight, would knowing about UN recognition have changed how you saw my choices?" The silence on the line was answer enough. "I should have stood up for you," she whispered. "Instead of defending them, I should have defended my sister." 3 days later, Catherine Morrison called personally to apologize, something I was told she'd never done in her adult life. Her tone was completely different from our previous interactions. "Mia, I owe you a profound apology. I had no understanding of the significance of your work, and my behavior was inexcusable." "Thank you for the apology, Catherine. I accept it. The Morrison Family Foundation would like to make a substantial contribution to your organization. Perhaps we could arrange a meeting to discuss ongoing support." The transformation from dismissal to opportunistic association was swift and transparent. I handled it diplomatically, directing her to our development office while maintaining professional distance. David called to apologize and invite me to dinner, where he spent 2 hours asking detailed questions about my work that felt less like genuine interest and more like damage control for his family's reputation. But the most meaningful change came from Grace herself. 2 weeks after the wedding, she called with an unusual request. "Mia, I want to visit one of your projects. Not for photos or publicity. I want to understand what you actually do." 3 months later, Grace spent 2 weeks at our family reunification camp in Jordan, working 12-hour days helping process refugee children separated from their parents. She came home changed, with a perspective on global responsibility that her previous life hadn't provided. "I never understood," she told me as we sat in her Manhattan apartment, looking at photos from her volunteer time. "I thought you were running away from normal life. I didn't realize you were running toward something more important than normal life." Our relationship began healing properly then, built on mutual respect rather than family obligation. The Morrison family's attempts to retroactively position themselves as supporters of my work were transparently opportunistic, but I accepted their foundation's substantial donation and their newfound social endorsement. Their money could help refugees regardless of their motives for giving it. 6 months after Grace's wedding, I stood before the UN General Assembly presenting new protocols for protecting civilians in active conflict zones. In the audience sat Grace, my parents, and James Whitfield, who'd become both mentor and friend. During the reception afterward, Grace pulled me aside. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. And I'm sorry it took someone else pointing out your achievements for me to see what was right in front of me. We're both learning, I replied. Family is complicated. Less complicated now, she said with a smile. Now I know my sister is basically a superhero, which explains why normal life never seemed to fit you. Standing in the UN building that night, surrounded by diplomats and humanitarian leaders who respected my work, I felt a profound sense of completion. Not because I'd finally received the recognition I'd always craved, but because I'd stopped needing it. My worth wasn't determined by my family's approval or society's validation. It came from the work itself, from the lives saved and the systems improved, and the small ways I helped hold civilization together in places where it was under assault. Grace's wedding had been a crucible that burned away the last of my need for acceptance from people whose values I didn't share. I'd stood firm in my identity despite social pressure, and in doing so, I'd found not just personal peace, but also the respect I'd never demanded. The woman who'd been laughed at for walking into that reception alone had become someone powerful enough to command rooms full of world leaders. But more importantly, she'd become someone who no longer needed anyone's permission to take up space in the world. James Whitfield found me on the UN building's terrace as the reception wound down, looking out over the East River toward the lights of Queens. Any regrets about that wedding night? He asked, only that it took me so long to stop apologizing for being exactly who I'm supposed to be. He nodded approvingly. The world needs more people who refuse to make themselves smaller for other people's comfort. As I prepared to return to Jordan the next week, I realized that Grace's wedding had been the best thing that could have happened to our family. Not because it was beautiful or meaningful, but because it forced all of us to confront who we really were when tested. I was someone who chose courage over comfort, service over security, purpose over approval. Grace was someone who could learn and grow and change when confronted with larger truths. And our family was something that could be repaired when built on honesty rather than expectations. The refugee camp in Jordan welcomed me back with the kind of genuine warmth that comes from shared mission rather than shared DNA. Children I'd helped reunite with families ran to greet me. Colleagues briefed me on developments I'd missed. The work continued, as it always did, sustained by purpose rather than applause. That night, setting up my tent in the camp coordinator's compound, I felt the deep satisfaction of being exactly where I belonged. The woman who'd fled that wedding reception in humiliation had returned to her real life with unshakable certainty about her worth and her choices. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones you fight for the right to be yourself. And sometimes winning means walking away from people who can't see your value, rather than trying to prove it to them. The lights of the refugee camp stretched out before me, each one representing a family rebuilding their lives with whatever dignity and hope they could maintain. This was my world, my people, my calling, and I had never been more certain that I was exactly where I belonged.